Hello, we are going to be talking about El Nino and the weather conditions that El Nino brings over the next few days. However, before we can get to El Nino, we need to back up and talk about what happens in the Pacific Ocean during a regular year and then during an El Nino year. So this map is going to help us explain El Nino. First, we have a regular year, and we have the Pacific Ocean, and some terms that you have to start getting familiar with in the Pacific Ocean is along the right side here where North America is and South America. This is referred to as the Eastern Pacific Basin. And then as you migrate this way to Indonesia and Australia, this is known as the Western Pacific Basin. So you'll have to get used to calling this side of the ocean the Eastern Pacific and then the Western Pacific. And right here, as you know, is your equator. So during a regular year, we've talked about this. We have trade winds that blow across the Pacific Ocean from the east to the west. And these easterly winds do something to the Pacific Ocean, and they bring warm water over here to the western side. So air is blown this way and warm water is pushed over here because, as you know, this is the equator, so it's very warm water. What this allows this climate in Australia and Indonesia and India to experience is nice rains, warm weather. This is a regular year. Like I said, this is normal conditions. The other thing that happens over on the Eastern Pacific Basin is something we've talked about called upwelling. Upwelling is that very nice current of water that comes up from deep in the Pacific. It brings lots of nutrients to the surface, allowing for a robust fishing industry. So we have lots of fish and a happy ecosystem. And again, this is during a regular year. And as you know, we're talking about the Pacific Ocean here, but what's going over here in the Atlantic Ocean? Hurricanes. We get lots of hurricanes on a regular yearly basis. That's going to be important for later. Okay, so now let's look at what happens during an El Nino year. So now we have El Nino conditions. So what happens? All of a sudden, and we don't really understand why, the trade winds that normally blow at the equator here start to decrease. They start to decrease and actually sometimes even stop. And so when these trade winds decrease or stop, guess what happens to this warm water? Well, if it's not being pushed over here, it's going to start to migrate. And all of a sudden, we have a lot of warm water in places that are going to be producing a lot of precipitation that aren't used to it. So all along the coast here of the western United States and places in South America like Peru are all of a sudden going to warm up and have a lot of heavy rain. And so where we see places on the Eastern Pacific Ocean, we get heavy rainstorms, massive flooding, and you're going to look and research all of the things that can happen when that warm water comes over here and floods the Eastern Pacific Basin. So then what happens over here in Australia and Indonesia is the opposite. Now the warm water and rain is over here and they're left with nothing, so they get a whole lot of drought, which is very important for places like India that have over 1 billion people living there. They need that water for their crops. So that is a socioeconomic situation that you also will be looking at in your research. The other thing that happens over here is that all of a sudden we have a lack of upwelling. No upwelling will occur up here because now we have that warm water It's forcing the water down so that current cannot come up. And so another effect of an El Nino year is a lack of nutrients and a lack of fishing and a not so happy ecosystem over here in the Eastern Pacific Basin.